If you're looking for an automatic field watch that's less than $150, then the odds are you're going to be looking at a Seiko, with the most likely choices being the Seiko's SNK and SNZG field watches. But there's another Japanese automatic field watch within the larger Seiko family that most people don't know or don't think about. It's the Orient Defender, and like most watches from Orient, it has its own unique spin on things. This is my third Orient I've reviewed, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the history of the company, except to point out that they were acquired by Seiko in 2009. Since then, Orient has specialized in making automatic and mechanical timepieces, all with in-house movements, and all with their unique flair for design. While not everyone knows about Orient, but for those that do, it's a watch that has some of the best value around. I first became aware of the Orient Defender late last year, when Orient USA began a rather amusing ad campaign on YouTube.
Of course you are. You're wearing your Orient Defender.
What? Who are you talking to?
I've been interested in getting my hands on one since then, but I specifically wanted the cream-colored version, which they unfortunately stopped producing and thus was a little harder to find, at least for a good price. About a month ago, I was lucky enough to find a good deal for one on eBay. Although interestingly enough, about a week after I got it, Orient USA announced that they're bringing back the cream-colored version. So maybe I wasn't that lucky after all, but I still got a good deal on it. Now I got this right after I did my Seiko SNZG video and field watches were already on the brain, and I immediately noticed that the Defender's design seems to have elements of both Seiko's SNZG and SNK field watches, and I'll point those out as we go. So let's get to the watch. The Defender has a 42mm stainless steel case with a brushed finish, with the exception of the crown, which has a little bit more of a polished look to it, contrasting nicely with the rest of the case. The finishing is good, and what you'd expect from an Orient at this price. Now, the crown is at the 4 o'clock position, just like the Seiko SNK, but for the Defender, it's actually a pretty good sized and not recessed at all, although it is still a screw-down crown. The Defenders do come in a variety of colors, and as I stated, this is the cream-colored version, which I like the best, although the slate gray is a close second. The hour indicators are an applied metal with white lume squares, with minute indicators painted on the dial in black. There are no Arabic indicators for hour or minutes on the main area of the dial, but a raised train track chapter ring rises out of the dial to meet the crystal. It's on this raised chapter ring that there are minute indicators as well as Arabic numerals painted on. In some ways, the dial is like the mini Flieger arrangement on the smaller SNK, but with the raised chapter ring of the SNZG. The Defender is a multifunction with 2 subdials, one for 24 hours at the 11 o'clock position, and a larger one at 3 o'clock for the day of the week. It may be hard to tell in the pictures, but the subdials are very slightly lower than the main dial, giving the whole thing just a little bit of depth. Unlike most multifunctions, there is no date subdial. Instead, you have a standard date window at the 6 o'clock position, with text in black on a white background. And this I really like. While I love the elegant look of a multifunction, 31 tiny indicators around a very small subdial is kind of hard to read. So to me, this is the best of both worlds. You have the elegant look of a multifunction, but with better usability. Now, just below the 24-hour subdial, you have the Orient logo, and a reflective silver to match the hour indicators. It's prominent, but the size is not overwhelming, Below that, the watch indicates it has a 100-meter water resistance. So it's not a watch that's designed to live in the water, but it's not a watch that you have to baby too much. You just might want to swap out that leather strap if water is in your future. At the very bottom of the subdial, you have an indicator stating a Japanese movement, and what I believe is the model and movement reference. Honestly, I'm not sure. It's very tiny and very hard to read. At the center of the dial, you have sword-shaped minute and hour hands in white loom with black outlines, as well as an arrow-like second hand, also in black, with a white loom tip. The black outline makes it a very striking and obvious contrast to the cream dial. And I really love the length of the hands, which go almost to the edge of the dial. Now, one thing I thought was interesting, the sword-shaped hands are more in the style of Seiko's SNK, yet the second hand is just like the SNZG. As I said, the design choices seem to be a mixture of the two Seikos, but since it's an Orient, it decided to do its own thing by adding the multifunction subdials. I can see how some people might find the dial a little busy, yet I find it to be an elegantly beautiful, yet highly functional design, especially on the cream-colored dial. Now on top of the case is a flat mineral crystal. And moving to the back, there is no exhibition case back, just a standard Orient screw-down case back with logo, and restating the water resistance. Now, one thing I've noticed on lower-end Orients is that they tend to omit an exhibition case back, and I'm okay with that. If I have to choose between an exhibition case back and having that value go towards a better strap or even better value into the watch itself, I'd rather choose the later. The Defender utilizes an Orient in-house 46B40 movement, which should have a 40-hour power reserve and run at a standard 21,600 beats per hour. Like its Seiko 5 cousins, it's not hackable or hand-windable. Now the date is quick-set and can be controlled by the first position of the crown, but unfortunately the day is not, and the only way to advance the day is by advancing the hour hand past midnight. Luckily, there are only 7 days in the week. This specific one runs about +7 seconds a day, which is not bad. But like all automatics, your mileage may vary. Now, in my opinion, the lack of hacking and hand winding holds the watch back a bit. Now, Orient does have a habit of updating its watches with newer movements, usually to include hacking and hand winding. The Gen 2 Orient Bambinos are a great example of this. So, while there is no Gen 2 Defenders yet, one can hope that they're thinking about it. The strap that the cream-colored Defender comes on is a brown leather with white stitching. Overall, it's fairly decent. While it's not very thick, and the loops are a little thin, it has a good texture and feel to it, and the signed buckle is a nice touch. Now, since the cream-colored Defender already comes with a nice strap and has a little bit of an elegant look to it, you don't really need to do much to dress it up. If anything, you might want to dress it down a bit, which you can always do by adding a NATO. Although one thing I do want to point out, that the clearance between the case and the spring bars is a little tighter than what you'd normally expect. Not too much, but it was enough that I couldn't get a thicker leather NATO through that clearance. Now let's talk about loom. And this is an area that I was a little disappointed in. It's not that the loom was bad, it's just not as good as I was hoping for. I was hoping that it would be as good as the Seiko SNZGs, but it doesn't appear quite as bright, which to me means that it's not Seiko's LumiBrite. Now, Orient is part of Seiko, but since I don't think this has LumiBrite Lume or a Hardlix crystal, it seems to me that Seiko isn't willing to share all of its toys with its new cousin. Now, one thing I do want to point out on the Lume. The Beige Defender's Lume profile is a little different than the other variants. If you look at the others, specifically the slate one, you can see that the entire hour indice is Lume. Where on the beige one, it's a small dot on the metal indice. So I'm guessing that the full Lume clashed too much with the beige color scheme. So I would assume that the other variants have a bit of a brighter Lume profile. So the dimensions of the Defender are fairly similar to Seiko's SNZG. It's 42mm wide without the crown and 45 width. Lug to lug is 48mm. And it's not too thick or too thin with a thickness of 12mm. It utilizes 22mm straps and has a decent weight of 82 grams. Let's start to wrap things up with a complimentary wrist shot. The Defender wears very well. It's large enough to be easily readable and visible, yet not too big. It's not overly thin at 12mm, but it's thin enough it shouldn't get in the way of any clothing. For my 7-inch wrist, I think it's a great size. So let's talk price. The MSRP is $250, but the market value is closer to $120 to $150. It all depends on the dial and the bracelet or strap you want. It's basically in the same price range as Seiko's SNZG field watches, which are also probably its biggest competitor. While the Seiko has a more traditional and utilitarian look, Orient's unique take on the design is a bit more elegant. Usually, if you want to have an elegant-looking field watch, you usually have to look at a Hamilton. But I think in this case, the Defender wouldn't look too out of place in a more upscale environment, especially the beige-colored variant. Although in some ways, that's also potentially a weakness, that it's almost too nice for a field watch, especially with the brown leather strap. It's the only field watch I've worn that I actually felt a little out of place wearing with just shorts and a t-shirt. Although swap it to a NATO, and it's much less of an issue. Now, when comparing it to the smaller SNK field watches, I can say that hands down, I prefer the Defender. But when comparing the Defender to Seiko's SNZG field watches, that's a bit of a tough one. I think it really comes down to personal style. Do you want a field watch that's more casual, or one that's a little more elegant? The Orient Defender is easy to read, giving you the information you need, just as a field watch should, yet attractive enough to stand out amongst a crowd. It adds a unique take to the classic field watch design, while still remaining familiar. It's a watch I'm very impressed with, and one I'd easily recommend. My only real complaint about it is the lack of hand winding on the movement. It's the one thing that keeps it from being a great watch instead of just a good watch. So let me know in the comments if you like the Orient Defender, or if you think the dial is too busy and prefer the more straightforward Seiko. Thanks for joining me, and as always, like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time.